Hey guys, HackerSploit here, back again with another video. Welcome back to the Red Team series. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the process of planning Red Team engagements, and we're going to be exploring quite a few things, one of which is the rules of engagement and some templates that you can use as a basis, not just of understanding what the rules of engagement typically are, but also some report templates that'll give you an idea as to what results are supposed to look like, or what report looks like. But the primary objective of this video is to give you a proper understanding of what the the process of planning Red Team engagements operations looks like, and what info or what some of the critical aspects or elements are with regards to planning for these operations. So the first starting point, as you know, if you are a pen tester, is the scope and objectives, right? So defining Red Team engagement goals can be difficult and tedious, primarily because there needs to be a synthesis between the Red Team and the client. Now, this is quite relevant, or more important, in the context of red teams, more so than it is when you're performing a pen test. The reason that is so is quite obvious. As I've mentioned previously in this series and in the preceding videos leading up to this video, Red Team operations are seen as ad hoc and random. However, as we've seen, what makes them appear this way is the fact that the scope can be quite large, making it quite complex, and consequently this complexity begins right as you're defining the scope and objectives, or rather I should say extrapolating the scope from the objectives that the company or the client has essentially communicated. Now, what that means is, firstly, the client needs to communicate what their ultimate objectives are. So why are they hiring you to perform the Red Team operation? What that means is, what do they want to know? Whenever you're performing a pen test or a Red Team operation or any security assessment of any kind, what you're selling to the client is the report, and the report needs to answer questions. The questions are again can be extrapolated from the objectives or are directly related to the objectives. So we'll get into some examples of what companies typically, or what objectives organizations typically lay out, but the tricky bit is, from those objectives we obviously extrapolate some sort of scope. So for example, if the organization says we want to know what our external threat surface looks like in terms of our publicly exposed assets or servers that are publicly accessible, well, from that point you can sort of see why the scope becomes important, more so in this particular case, because then the first question that anyone would ask, or a Red Team lead would ask, or even a pen tester, is, okay, could you explain or define what you mean by publicly exposed assets? And at that point they would say, well, our website, the client would say, our website is off. You can't touch the websites, or these particular APIs, or these particular domains or subdomains. You get the idea. Now, the reason this is difficult in the context of Red Team operations, and I used a very simplistic example there, is because if you're talking about a proper Red Team operation or adversary emulation campaign, you're obviously going to be doing a lot of things, or your scope is going to be very wide with regards to the activities you're performing. So the bottom line is that you really need to ensure that the client understands, or you and the client understand what is, or what the scope is, or what you can or cannot do with regards to the types of attacks you can run, so on and so forth. So this is especially true for organizations new to red teaming. Whether you're on the delivery or receiving end of a Red Team engagement, the solid goals must be decided and agreed upon to have a successful Red Team engagement. And that's a very good point there. If there is a dichotomy or misunderstanding, when the objectives and the scope are being defined, especially in relation to the client, if they have different objectives, or they wanted something completely different, or had a different idea as to what the outcomes are, regardless of the results, and then you go ahead and do something else, and the report again, is not what they're looking for, or tells them very little about what they're focused on, that can be quite problematic. And again, if you want to have a successful red team engagement, and what I define as successful is answering the questions that the client wants answered. So for example, can we defend against this APT group, or an APT group with the following TTPs? Is our blue team able to, again, detect and defend against these types of attacks? Is our organization susceptible to phishing campaigns or to phishing attacks? Are our employees following the security policies? Stuff like that, right? And so in the report, if you don't answer these questions and you go on different tangents talking about how some servers have this vulnerability and they can be exploited, therefore, so on and so forth, you get the idea. It's not answering the question. So you need to have there needs to be a synthesis between you and the client in terms of, what they want answered. So when analyzing a client's desired objectives, one key factor to consider is the depth and nature of the engagement. Now, red team engagements can typically be categorized into, full simulation or an extended pen test, which is a standard red team operation, or adversary emulation, right? Now, the type of engagement to utilize and the corresponding methodology used will heavily depend on the objectives defined by the client. Once objectives have been defined, engagement plans will need to be set up to further expand on the specifics of the engagement. So the company tells you these are objectives. You then say, okay, if these are your objectives, you then come up with the engagement plan extrapolated from the objectives, and you say, based on what you laid out as the objectives, this is what we have come up with. Please tell us whether this is in alignment not only with the objectives, but fits within the scope that you have defined, if they've defined it yet. Or the engagement plans will end up defining the scope with a few minor adjustments. Another key factor to consider, as I said, is the engagement scope. The scope of an engagement will depend on the target infrastructure as well as, the client's requirements. And these are very esoteric, as you know, if you're a pen tester. So the scope outlines what you can or cannot do, or can or cannot target, and what you can or cannot use in terms of tools or software. And the scope is always defined by the client and should be strictly adhered to. Now, that's not always the case in terms of definition. As I said, in certain cases, it could be a collective definition where you come up with the engagement plans extrapolated by the objectives the organization laid out, and you say, okay, based on this is what the scope should be, or, what scope did you have in mind? And then you can come up with a synthesized scope that encapsulates the client's objectives and also encapsulates the engagement plans. So again, it's not always the case that they'll be defined, before the fact. But there's something you need to keep in mind. Now, you may be asking, well, what are some of these objectives? Can you give us some examples, Alexis? Well, yes, I can. So these are some examples of objectives you typically see, specifically in the case of red team operations. So the first one is identify the system's configurations and network weaknesses. Very broad, as you can see. They might be a little bit specific and say focus on external public facing systems. So from that objective, you're then able to say, okay, so based on this, you can define the scope and then come up with the engagement plan or the plan for the red team operation. You communicate it with the client, they agree on it, rules of engagement is defined, so on and so forth. Another example of an objective is to determine the effectiveness of endpoint detection and response systems. That's again quite wide in terms of, or quite broad in terms of what they're asking you, but you can see that in the report, they want to know whether the endpoint detection and response systems or the EDR systems that they may be recently installed are working or are effective. And then you would come up with a plan and say, well, based on that, we can try we can come up with a red team operation that focuses on, that essentially assesses the EDR's capabilities. Another example of an objective is to evaluate the overall security posture and response. So that can be further extrapolated or broken down into the SIEM and detection measures, remediation, segmentation of DMZ and internal servers. And of course, another example is to evaluate the impact of data exposure and exfiltration, where they're essentially telling you, can you show us, what exactly is possible in terms of, whether if an attacker was, or a threat actor or an APT group was to breach our organization, what could they expose, or what data could they exfiltrate, all things considered. So you get the idea. Now, when we talk about the rules of engagement, again, if you're a pen tester, you should be very, very familiar with this, also known as the ROE. The rules of engagement establish the responsibility, relationship, and guidelines between the red team, the network owner, the system owner, and any stakeholders required for engagement execution. The ROE documents the target information, approvals, threat implementation, activities, and issues required to staff, coordinate, and execute engagements within the target environment. So in essence, it essentially lays out the responsibility, the relationship, and the guidelines between the red team, the network owner or network administrator or system administrator, the system owner, and any other stakeholders, like maybe, project manager for that particular operation, etc. And the ROE documents the, information about the target, any approvals that need to be put in place, before the operation is commenced, that needs to be signed by relevant stakeholders. The threat implementation, what that means is, what is your engagement plan? What are you going to do? All the activities and all the issues required to staff. So, the members of your red team, who is responsible for what, the coordination between the two, the communication, not only between or in between the members of the red team or the red team operators, but also communication, frequent communication between you, if you were the red team lead, and the client to provide them with updates, etc., etc. So it's a very important document. Now, building onto that, it also outlines the scope and objectives of the engagement so that it's clearly stated. And the ROE establishes the responsibility, relationship, and guidelines between, as I've already said, the red team, network owner, the system owner, stakeholders, etc. And we've already gone through that. Now, the body of the ROE document should have the following information: the methodology being used or the methodology that was followed, but ideally, of course, the methodology that's being used. A high-level description of the types of activities that may be executed. So the attack kill chain, or what your attack will look like in terms of TTPs, the sequence of the activities, the types of hardware and software that may be employed. If hardware is going to be employed, that needs to be stated. In terms of software, you want to state what attack tools or infrastructure will be used. So for example, Cobalt Strike, so on and so forth. There's another important thing, a recommended deconfliction process, essentially a process that outlines, the process and procedures for communicating certain events, communicating updates, and of course, deconfliction. And then, of course, the rules and responsibilities of each functional group, more specifically within your own red team, amongst the red team operators. So who is responsible for what? Who is responsible for initial access? Who is responsible for exfiltration? So on and so forth. The identification and references to appropriate legal requirements. So this is where you have your guidelines or your standards, like, whether there are any compliance or regulatory requirements that need to be factored in. So if the companies are, dealing with, their customers' financial information or, credit card details, you'll obviously see PCI there. You also have HIPAA, SOX, etc. So again, the ROE should show, references to specific legal requirements that set the basis for what you can and cannot do. And finally, but not conclusively, a legal responsibility disclaimer. This is a federally, again, depending on the country you operate in, a federally mandated requirements for the red team to report certain findings. So this is in reference to, if you find any, let's say, X-rated content, or any, not X-rated, but, content of a certain nature that is illegal, your responsibility to report it to the relevant authorities. And that, again, goes both ways. Communication, you're again communicating and disclaiming this to the client that, hey, if we find anything that's illegal, we are legally required to disclose it. So just something that you need to keep in mind. Now, when it comes down to planning red team operations, as I've already stated, this can be quite difficult and is true for organizations new to red teaming, organizations that are, getting their first red team operations orchestrated. So whether you're on the delivery or receiving end of a red team engagement, a solid plan must be laid out. Now, the red team engagement planning can be broken down into 4 primary types. You have your engagement plan. So this outlines the technical requirements of the red team. So ConOps, the resource requirements, and of course the timelines. I've already explained ConOps in the introduction to red teaming video, so you can refer to that. That's why I stated in that video the essential terminology. You then have the operations plan. This is quite simple to understand. This essentially a detailed version of the engagement plan with the roles and responsibilities for each operator. You then have the mission plan. So this is the execution plan. This states who will do what commands or what TTPs or techniques or sub-techniques will be executed, when they are to be executed, and the operator responsible for executing a specific thing. Essentially what this means is, hey, Mr. Operator 1, you are going to be responsible for privilege escalation. These are the TTPs that you should, that you're going to be responsible for executing, or I should say techniques or sub-techniques. And you must adhere to them and not go outside of this. Then, of course, you have your remediation plan. This outlines the next phase of the engagement once the operation is done or concluded, and that's, of course, the reporting and remediation. So, to conclude this video, I want to give you some really cool resources, the links to which will be actually added in the description section of this video. But what I'm going to be highlighting are some sample red team rules of engagement and reporting documents or templates that can, again, verify or validate what I've explained in the slides, but also serve as a basis for you to, again, get a better understanding of red team operations right from the planning phase all the way to, the execution or reporting and remediation phase. So just going to switch over and I'll see you in a couple of seconds. All right, so I'm back in my browser, and one of the resources I want to share with you, and again, you can use it as a guide, is redteam.guide. It's a website called redteam.guide, so the URL is just redteam.guide. Link will be in the description section. The Red Team Guide is a really cool resource that's based on a book that I highly recommend you check out or get, called Red Team Development and Operations, which is a practical guide to red team operations. So this book has this complimentary website, that, it offers you this complimentary website, which is free. You don't need to buy the book to access this, but it essentially has guides that you can refer to. And one or a couple of them are going to be, for example, if you take a look at the references, templates and presentations, you're going to have your templates here. So you have your operator log. So your operator log is a spreadsheet typically that's given to every red team operator that they use to outline all the activities they've done or that they've performed on the target system or on the target environment. This is very useful, and it's time-stamped so that at the end of the day, you have accountability as to who did what, when they did it, and what the result of that action was. You then have the rules of engagement example document here, and then the red team report example. So those are the templates. You can also take a look at the checklist and planning. So, in terms of, you can see this set of checklists is intended to be a start to help and plan build each red team. Each design may have additional requirements. Use this as a starting point and modify as you see fit. So this is a checklist, red team development checklist, where you determine the required knowledge and skills, develop the roles and responsibilities guide, develop a red team methodology or adapt one, develop TTP guidance for engagement. So that's when you're developing your red team. And then you have your red team engagement checklist. So before you start any red team, you go through this checklist. We use one that's quite similar. So you start with your rules of engagement. Is there an event communication plan? Is the deconfliction process been distributed to all stakeholders, all relevant parties? Entry point method is the scope defined, the goals and objectives, the target restrictions, the target infrastructure, any approvals that are required, scenario development if there is, if you're performing adversary emulation, operational impact planning, so the impact of your operations on the target organization's digital infrastructure or the organization as a whole, develop the threat profiles, plan the threat infrastructure which may be required, especially if you're performing threat or adversary emulation, acquire infrastructure, so on and so forth. And then you have your execution checklist. So the daily completion and roll-up confirmation, every operator capturing their logs or logging their activity, screenshots being captured, system changes being captured. There's a daily or twice daily mandatory internal RT sitrep. I've already explained what sitrep is. An update, update the real-time attack diagram, which outlines where you are in terms of the attack kill chain. And then the culmination, this is the red, checklist for the culmination. So engagement closeout, roll-up data, rollback system changes if any were made, validate the data has been collected, outline the critical attack diagram or the attack, the attack flow or the attack kill chain, as it were. The technical review, tech on tech. So this is you, the red team lead with the red team operators. Sharing notes, and then of course the executive brief, and then of course you have reporting where you have the draft attack narrative, the draft observation and findings, finalize the attack diagram, and then finalize the report. And now you can take a look at the rules of engagement here. So this pretty much contains what I specified there, and you can take a look if you go back to the references, templates, and presentations page. We can start off with the operator log. I'm just going to download these 3 documents. I'll disregard the CSV because I like an Excel template. These are completely safe, by the way. You can take my word for that. As of recording this video, if something happens in the future, obviously if you're downloading any documents, do so in a sandbox or virtual environment. But I'll just download them and we'll start off with the operator log and I'll explain what it is, which I've already done, but how it's used. All right, so we're starting off with the operator log. You can see it's a very simple spreadsheet that just contains a log of all your activities. So left here, you have your date timestamp, date and time timestamp that allows you to specify when you started an activity, when you stopped, the source IP. So if you're running this from a command and control infrastructure, what the IP is, the destination IP or the IP address of the target system, the destination port, if any, the destination system, the host name that is, the pivot IP if there is a pivot point, the pivot port, the URL if relevant, the tool or app that you ran pertinent to this action or activity, the command you ran. So in this case, proxy chains, we're essentially using proxy chains to proxy through maybe the pivot point here, it looks like, and you can see the description or the reason why you did this was to test the ability for Foothold to communicate with internal servers. So yes, indeed, you're using proxy chains to, again, proxy through the pivot point or the pivot system. Then the output, you can see port 80 was open. So the result was successful communication. Whether there, was there any system modification or modification as a result of running a particular, this particular action or this particular task? No, there wasn't. Comments, very useful. Access to the target server via Foothold 1, and then the operator name here. So this is very important during a red team operation. And of course, I know there's many other tools or automation tools you can use to log your activity. Everyone has their own tools. But when I was building my red team, I started with a spreadsheet, and again, very, very useful. You can't deny the efficacy or just how useful a spreadsheet can end up being, especially when you don't have the funding to get some of the third-party commercial software that again is used specifically for or by red teams. That's not an excuse, but the spreadsheet is always is always there if you need it. And this is arguably one of the best operator log templates that I've seen. So that's the operator log. As I said, as you continue to do different things, you provide your, start time, end time, and all the other data here. And at the end of the day, you again have an update call, between yourself, other members of the red team, or the operators and the red team lead, just to assess what was done, whether there are any impacts, so on and so forth. And of course, to ensure that you're on track with the red team operation with regards to its timeline. So that's the operator log. Let me switch over to the rules of engagement. All right, so this is the rules of engagement document template that I downloaded, and you can see how this works. So, this is just a standard template. You have your client name, the date, and then you have your executive summary, what the objectives are as we discussed. And you can see the disclaimer here that signing of the ROE constitutes acknowledgement and approval of the customer, system owner, and red team of the red and the red team of the red team's authorities. And the red teams here is referring to the actual name of your organization in execution of the engagement. And then explicit restrictions, where restrictions are specified explicitly and agreed upon, the authorized target space, which is pretty much your scope, and then the activities that you'll be performing in terms of tactics. And this is where the MITRE ATT&ck framework comes into play. And more importantly, if you remember in the slides, I mentioned that you also specify the methodology, or the nomenclature you're using. And in most cases, you'll typically use the attack framework as a basis, or as essentially as the nomenclature for defining your activities. So you could say in terms of tactics, reconnaissance, initial access, privilege escalation. You can dive a little bit deeper into the techniques or sub techniques under each of those tactics. Over here you have your table of contents, fairly self-explanatory. You can see here now we're actually defining the rules of engagement, what they mean. References here, you specify any references, the scope, the definitions of the scope. So, sorry, not the definitions of the scope, but rather the definitions. So rules of engagement and support agreement. So this is where you essentially state, I Love Red Teams Inc. has been agreed upon to conduct a red team engagement and supporting red team activities. This document provides the ground rules for planning, executing, and reporting the engagement. You then provide a short description of the services requested and information about the requesting entity. The following systems, networks, and/or assets will be included. So the list of business, organization, systems, and networks included. All software and hardware included as a target during the engagement. And then, of course, the objective. So the engagement is designed to, you specify the objectives. This means the system must... the systems within the scope in alignment with the objectives will be tested, assessed, evaluated, or stress tested, as it were. For the red team, an open network will be utilized. An open network is defined as a network with access to the internet. So you actually define what you'll be using, how you'll be using it. Cutting a long story short, how you'll be conducting this engagement or operation. And you need to do it very clearly so that after the fact, there's no legal dispute regarding, hey, you guys didn't tell us you do this or that, so on and so forth. And then you specify the responsibilities of the customer. And then right over here, there will be a complete and open coordination with all stakeholders required for the engagement execution. Stakeholders are the parties represented by the signatories of this document. And you can see just how fine or how fine-grained and granular the rules of engagement needs to be from a legal perspective, in that you actually need to define what each term means, and by signing it, or by you signing it and the client signing it, they agree not only to what you've defined technically in relation to the engagement or the operation, but also the nomenclature used. So for example, stakeholders, once the client signs it, then the definition of stakeholders are exactly what is stated here. The red team activities are limited to the target of engagement. Red team tools and activities may be intrusive, but will not intentionally disrupt services outside the authorizations of these rules of engagement. And then you specify here, the red team will provide updates as follows. You specify the the update types, the conditions, the date and time, etc., if that is to be agreed upon. And then the customer or the client will, and then you specify the responsibilities. So, provide the red team administrative facilities and support for all red team personnel as necessary to conduct the engagement if it's on site. Provide support with network and resources for conducting the engagement, including adequate workspace, a quiet facility. So this is where you lay out what you require. Once the client signs it, again, they're legally obligated to, provide you with this, whatever is agreed upon here. And likewise, whatever whatever responsibilities you are binded to, you will need to, comply with them. Moving on, you can see if I just proceed a little bit into here. There we are. So the sensitive information reporting. Vulnerabilities discovered during the engagement that present an immediate risk to life, limb, or eyesight will be reported promptly to the person, the point of contact, to enable immediate response or action. Representatives of the signatories of this ROE will receive the follow-on notification as appropriate. Incidental discovery, and this is what I was referring to when we were talking about reporting of certain stuff to the legal authorities. Incidental discovery of information that relates to serious crimes such as sabotage, threats, or plans to commit offenses that threaten life or could cause significant damage to loss or customer property, and which does not present an immediate risk, will be reported to the applicable local authorities for action. The red team reporting is otherwise conducted in a way that does not attribute information or particular activity to an individual. That means within the report, you can say that employee XYZ or John Doe he responded or opened up various phishing emails and downloaded attachments. It needs to be, it cannot be personal. You cannot include any, individual information. And this goes, again, this is both ways. In this case, it's referring to, the operator's details. So moving on, red team activities may not be conducted in support of law enforcement or criminal investigation purposes. Moving on, cease operation processes. So this stipulates the the process to follow in term, if there is if you get to the point where operations need to be ceased. So the red team will suspend activity upon detection of computer anomalies that could potentially be unauthorized intrusions into target of environment networks. The red team will suspend activity when unintentional information as described above is encountered and until the appropriate reporting has taken place. Information usage, deconfliction, very important. All detected information assurance incidents, whether real world or alleged red team activity, should immediately be reported using normal incident reporting processes. The customer or system owner, if there's a difference between the two, point of contact may contact the red team's point of contact to determine if discovered activities are the result of the red team. And then, of course, the deliverables. So the red team will provide an engagement summary presentation for the target of engagement representatives at the completion of the engagement. The red team will provide a written summary of the engagement results to the POC or point of contact representative within 30 days following the completion of the test. So this is very important. This way where you say what you're going to deliver and when you're going to deliver it after completion of the operation. Then, of course, you have your ROE provisions, and then the requirements, restrictions, and authority, which again you can go through. There's the ground rules here. So this section identifies specific rules associated with the execution of this event. That can be broken down into network operations, cloud operations, physical engagement. So all the following areas are off limits to the red team personnel, including transient movement due to potential loss of life. So if you're doing a physical engagement, then the client can specify, hey, you guys can do what you want, but you can't enter this office or that particular area, or you can't enter this particular room, so on and so forth. The same can be done in terms of provisioning or specifying restrictions to buildings or premises, so on and so forth. And then, of course, there's the resolution of issues or points of contact. So in the event that any issues may occur or develop which are not covered by this ROE, will be resolved mutually with all stakeholders. You have the CIO representative, the title, full name, phone number, email. You get the idea. If there is a white cell lead, by the way, I already explained this, so refer to the introduction video if you'd like to know about the different roles and responsibilities within a red team in conjunction with the client. But here you have the red team lead and the red team technical lead. And then, of course, authorization, approval, and there needs to be signing from everyone. And then, of course, you have the appendix here, which specifies the target environment, the authorized, all that good stuff. And then the points of contact here, engagement director, the trusted agent, the white cell lead, emergency contact, the red team lead. And then in the appendix C, section C, you have the red team methodology. So this is where you outline the methodology that you're going to use. And again, this is where you can now align it with frameworks like the MITRE-ATT&ck framework, where you can use the name of tactics. In this case, that's not the case because you can have exploitation. In the MITRE-ATT&ck framework, you typically have initial access, and then here, post-exploitation, you specify what you're going to be doing in terms of techniques or sub-techniques. So identifying domain user group memberships, identifying the IP space, so, local enumeration, and then persistence. So no privilege escalation here. Actually, that looks like it falls under exploitation. And then, of course, lateral movement, continued enumeration, and then you lay out impact here, and then you have your engagement objectives. So hopefully this makes sense. Now the final section, the threat profile, this is when you're performing adversary emulation. So as part of the red team engagement, or we, your organization, Red Team Inc. Will be replicating the TTPs associated with a group known as, let's say, APT29. This threat has been known to exploit and attack the systems and networks servicing the transactional records, customer order database, and XYZ of organizations similar to. So the threat profile in this case, when you're performing adversary emulation, you typically will select an APT group that again aligns or has been known to target your client or the client you're performing the red team operation for in terms of geographic location, the industry the client operates in. So, if the client is operating, let's say, in North America and is a financial services company, then you'd find APT groups that target those types of organizations or those types of companies in that APT groups that target North American companies, but more importantly, that target companies in the financial sector that offer financial services of a certain kind. That allows you to give the organization or the client a realistic, holistic view of what they're likely to face based on, APT groups or the adversarial TTPs that APT groups who target that particular geographic region and industry or type of companies utilize. So, you're not using TTPs of an APT group that targets companies in Southeast Asia, because again, that might not be entirely too realistic unless that particular APT group targets countries in East Asia in addition to companies in North America. But there we are. You go ahead and specify the TTPs you'll be emulating. You can be a little bit more detailed. I typically include, the MITRE-ATT&ck navigator layer here or an image of it that aids in explaining what exactly we'll be doing. But yeah, that is the rules of engagement. All right, the final thing we'll touch on, based on the Red Team Guides website, is the reporting template. Again, a link to all of these templates and as well as the Red Team Guides website, by the way, a huge shout out to them, will be in the description section for you to peruse yourself at your own time. But this is an example of what a red team typical, I would say, it's generic, but what a red team report would look like. And you'll be able to tell if you're a pen tester what the differences are between a red team report and a pen testing report. They're fairly similar. But here you have your executive summary, where you specify, again, executive summary is exactly that. It's a summary for, the C-suite level within the client, essentially summarizes right over here the goals included, the following, the observations, and then, of course, the summary of goals and objectives achieved. Moving on, you have your table of contents, the methodology and goals. where you now dive a little bit, or you know, make this a little bit more detailed, or, you know, lay out now with a lot more detail what you did. So scenario and scope. So this is where you specify, and remember I talked about the types of red team operations in the introductory video. This is where you specify the scenarios. So the red team engagement, or the type of red team operation you're performing. So the red team engagement was based on the assumed breach model. So in this case, there's no initial access within your operation. You're again just going to assume, or you're going to get, the client may provide you with provision, or you may connect, let's say, a jump box in the target organization's network, where you're assuming that, you know, you've already breached the organization. In this case, utilizing external command and control, a coordinating phishing attack was used to begin the test and involved the support of a trusted agent within the organization you're performing the red team operation for. The coordinated phish was followed by a phishing attack against real-world users who did not have any knowledge of the engagement. The approach of the assumed breach model allows the test to begin quickly and later use access gained from the phishing attack to validate actions. The scope is defined there, and then you have your miscellaneous stuff in here. And then the attack narrative, this is the attack diagram I was referring to, where you outline visually, you always use a diagram or a flowchart, but you essentially explain. You can see here each of these phases has a numbering or sequencing. So step one was targeting workstations. You can see it says the attack narrative. The following section outlines the sequence of events and highlights the key points during the engagement. So workstations were targeted first, or the initial attack, where, you know, the execution of the C2 agent, credential harvesting, attempt to move laterally to the client workstations. This is highlighted in green, which means it worked. Or rather it didn't. You can look at the color coding. So green is unsuccessful, red is successful. So again, you can see that color coding is going to be you know, up to you and your team, but it should be stated in the legend. So now that I looked at the legend, if I was an executive of the client for whom this red team operation was performed for, I can start to understand what's going on. So step one, maintaining C2 access. 2 is lateral movement. 3, lateral movement privilege escalation. 4 is backup data exfiltration. And in this case, the execution of the C2 agent was successful. Credential harvesting was successful. Attempt to move laterally to servers was successful. And the technique here was the SMB name pipe connection. That was the pivot technique. This brought us to servers, where you know, the execution of the SMB name pipe C2 agent was successful. In this case, I think had the Havoc C2 framework was used. Credential harvesting was successful, where we gained clear text passwords of multiple domain accounts. However, attempting to move laterally to client workstations did not seem to work. The techniques we tried out were we were unable to connect for whatever reasons. And then of course you can proceed on and you know, explore. You can explore whether exfiltration was successful. In this case, it does not look like it was successful. So this diagram just tells the organization or your client, this is what we did in alignment with what we agreed on. This is what worked, what didn't. For the techniques or sub techniques that worked, this is what it led us to, or this is what we're able to do with that. And yeah, so fairly simple. And then of course you provide a description of each critical step. This is your standard, your pen testing, where you report your vulnerabilities, or your POC, proof of concept, where you outline the vulnerabilities you found, how it can be replicated, so on and so forth, and any other references, any other tools you used. But in this case, you pretty much outline it as a critical step. It's entirely up to you how you want to format it, but that's how it is. And then observations and recommendations, which is self-explanatory. So there we are. That brings us to the end of this video. The objective of this video, as I stated earlier on, or in the beginning of the video, was to give you an introduction into the process of planning a red team operation, and walk you through the process of laying out the objectives, the scope, rules of engagement, and then moving on to the actual engagement itself and some resources there, that being the operator log, and finally the reporting. And I've given you an example of what this looks like. With that being said, that's going to be it for this video. If you like this video, found value in it, please leave a like down below. If you have any questions or suggestions, please leave them in the comment section. If you want to continue the conversation with regards to this video or other videos within the Red Team series, a link to the thread or category on the HackerSploit forum, available or accessible on forum.hackersploit.org, has been added to the description section of this video, as well as the pinned comment in the comment section, so you can refer to it if again you wanted a documented version of this video with a link to all the resources, which again are already in the description section. But if you wanted something written, you can do so there. If you want to continue the conversation regarding these videos, and if you have any important questions, the forum is the right place to look. With that being said, that was quite a mouthful, but that brings us to the end of the video, as I said, and now we'll be moving to the more practical stuff, namely adversary emulation. So this brings us to the end of the slides, or the videos that have an excessive amount of theoretical information, and now we'll get to put everything we've learned, or now that we have the fundamentals with regards to red teaming, we're now able to move into stuff like adversary emulation and actually perform a red team operation. So that's going to be it, and I'll be seeing you in the next video. Stay safe.